There's a quote in the musical Miss Saigon that I think we could really do with hearing more from. I don't understand why it isn't in memes, why it isn't in these little things you see on the internet, because I think it's... hi, Les. I think that it's a significant quote. The quote is, "War isn't over when it ends. Some pictures never leave your mind." That's true for us, isn't it? War isn't over when it ends. Some pictures never leave your minds. I guess it's because the pictures go in too deep and you can't just shake them off. Those pictures are there. So here's some of the pictures that have been with me for almost 40 years now. And so I'm using them to string them together to make my talk. And if my voice runs out, I've written it all out in long form, so Colin will come and continue. Colin's also recording it so that hopefully we can just put the talk out on YouTube so you can hear it again if you want to. So the first picture in my mind would be the Islander aircraft. It's kind of red orangey colour, and 8-seater, 10-seater small plane that the government of the Falklands would use to fly around the islands. And it was flying very low down Stanley Harbour. For those of you who haven't been to Stanley, Stanley Harbour is huge, 7 miles long from one end to the other, with a very narrow entrance in the northeast corner, just wide enough for a medium-sized ship to get through. And then the outer harbour is called Port William. But Stanley Harbour is very long, and it's probably one of the world's most amazing natural harbours. So flying from the airport very low down Stanley Harbour to land, we presumed, on the racecourse. That would be the first picture in my mind. I really didn't see the invasion coming. I was 10 years old, almost 11 years old, and I didn't know anything of it. Of course, now I can look back and I can see things coming together. I can see all these pieces of the jigsaw coming together and thinking, oh yeah, they were planning something. Those weren't just random, mysterious events. Those RGs were up to something. But at the time, I was just living my life peacefully and happily in my beautiful islands. So let's look at the 1st of April, 1982. It was just an ordinary day for me. Slightly unordinary in that the book that I was reading, James and the Giant Peach, great read, but a bit surreal. I was reading that book and I accidentally left it and my reading glasses at school. So that was an unusual thing. But apart from that, it was just an ordinary day. We're expecting to have a Royal Marine friend of ours, Andy MacDonald, staying at our house overnight. It was Royal Marines changeover time. Normally 40 guys were on a detachment in Stanley and they would be there for a year. Changeover time meant there were too many Royal Marines to be accommodated in their barracks. So the ones who were leaving out would spend a few days handover with the local people who they got to know. So Andy was supposed to be staying with us. That was just the only other unusual thing, but Andy would be coming and going anytime. And I expect he's listening to this talk. So, hey, Andy, thanks for that. So there I was, come home from school, went outside my house because it was an okay day. Right outside my house, there was a playing field. This is a perfect place for a kid to live. Swings, seesaw, big area where we could play rounders. Great place. And I was out there sitting on one of the swings when this Islander, the plane, came flying down the harbour very, very low. I looked up towards our house and their mum and dad were standing out on the street and I shouted, "What's going on?" And they were like, "Shh." Okay. Normally it's okay to shout what's going on if something's going on, but they were summoning me in to come inside now. So I went inside and Mum had explained to me that she'd been busy that day. She'd been to Government House. My mum was the head senior nursing sister of the hospital. And so she and many of the other heads of departments in Stanley had been called to Government House to have explained to them that the Argentine military forces were heading towards the Falklands and we need to prepare for war. And so Mum and her staff have been very busy getting the hospital ready, finding out how many bandages, how much medical stuff, going into the loft and getting out these ancient World War II, maybe even World War One stretchers that they'd stored up there just in case. Well, all of those just in cases had come together. My dad, who was a volunteer in the fire brigade, but also handyman, so employed to do that, suddenly became chief of the fire brigade overnight because the current chief of the fire brigade said, "Mate, I'm going to be busy tonight with an SLR and a Morse code key. Can you do fire brigade until future?" So Dad was like, well, okay, so we need to take an inventory of all the equipment that we have. We need to find out actually who's available for fire. So all of those things. Our house was very busy. I went into the house and noticed that Andy's bed had been packed away. He wasn't coming at all. It all got very serious. Mum explained, no, you know what's going to happen? Andy's going to be out there tonight fighting with the Royal Marines. I never even thought that Andy was anybody apart from Andy, but hey, those Royal Marines were out there seriously doing their stuff that night. So after supper, we were sitting around our table and there was the serious announcement from Rex Hunt, later to become Sir Rex Hunt, explaining indeed that Argentine military forces were heading towards our islands and they were expected to land overnight. And we had to stay in our houses. We're not supposed to resist them in any way. Lovely news that school was cancelled didn't even seem very exciting either. We just had to wait and see what happened. We're instructed to keep the radio on and that the radio would be playing all night. So Mum and Dad came and went all evening. And there was this horrible, tense feeling of not knowing what was going to happen next, because indeed nobody did know what was going to happen next. I didn't know what war was. We didn't have any TV. I'd seen a few newsreels. I remember seeing a newsreel, film reel to reel about tanks. No idea what that was about. Some of the lads had tank toys and those little plastic soldiers you get out of the cornflakes boxes, but really no idea what war was. That was something that old people talked about. That's something that happened in other countries. That really wasn't something that I knew anything about. Pictures number 2 would be, how can I summarize Invasion Day in one picture? It's just loads of pictures and I'll pick out a few as I go along. So 2nd of April 1982, there I am sleeping upstairs in a wooden house. It's a bungalow, but my dad had converted the loft and made a bedroom out of it. And I woke to the sound of shooting. The only shooting I'd really heard before was rifle shooting geese, maybe a shotgun shooting our mostly missing geese, the ceremonial guns on Victory Green that were fired, blanks, of course, for the Queen's birthday. So I didn't really know what the guns were, so I woke up not remembering anything about invasion because I was just waking up and I didn't really know what was going on. And I heard these huge bangs and explosions and shooting, and I'm thinking, what's going on Victory Green this early in the morning? My first thought. No idea what was happening, still quite dark outside, and my dad came creeping up, or creaking up, because the stairs were a bit creaky, up to my bedroom and just opened the curtains, opened the window a bit. It was cold, it was April, it was 6 months from April in UK terms. Anyway, it was autumn, cold air coming in the window. And I'm like, what's Dad doing? And I could hear these voices outside, British voices, men's voices, swearing voices, very nearby. No idea what it was. So Dad just closed the window again. There was some shooting going on outside and said, come on, it's time to get up now. You should come downstairs. So I laid there for a little moment, letting all this soak in, wondering what was going on. And actually Dad had seen Royal Marines standing outside one of their groups. My uncle's house was next door, but one on the corner of a hill. Outside the house, there was a red letterbox, and they'd used this letterbox to rest their machine gun on, and they were shooting across to the football pitch and towards Government House and the rocks behind Government House. Since met some of those Royal Marines and had a good chat with them. They've apologised for the noise they made in waking me up that morning. I'm like, hey, that's the noise that you need for freedom. And if you ever go back to the Falklands, there was still the fence opposite with some bullet holes in it. And those bullet holes were put there by the RG, so they only go 3/4 of the way down the fence. They just missed the Royal Marine who was laying down by perhaps 6 inches. If he was any chubby around the tummy, he would have got those bullets rather than the fence. It was that close and that real. So I stood up and I looked out of my window because I was supposed to be going downstairs and there was a war on, but I hadn't read the memo that you're meant to lay low. I hadn't read the memo that upstairs in a wooden house isn't the best place to be on the first day of a war. So I had to look outside to see what was going on. By then, those Royal Marines had gone from their position by the letterbox, and there were instead some dark-clothed Argentine soldiers just creeping along with their guns and kind of doing that creepy thing that soldiers do. Hats on. You say, I'm really good. Sorry, guys. Well, I would do a demonstration of creeping along low with your gun, trying to be a creepy Argentine soldier. My military knowledge, as you will hear throughout this talk, is not very good. And I'll just describe the pictures that I saw, okay? So I looked out my window, my curtains, nice pictures of roses on, little girl's bedroom window, and then looked out, saw these Argentine soldiers creeping along, not being creepy soldiers, but creeping along. This isn't supposed to be the laughing part, okay? Behave. And then I looked over towards the football pitch, which wasn't too far away from our house, and it was getting quite a bit lighter by then. And what I saw was a picture that stuck with me really forever. And I saw a soldier running out into the middle of the football pitch, more shooting, lots of shooting going on, and then he was shot and he fell to the ground and he just laid there. And I just stood and I stared, kind of frozen to the spot, but legs a bit wobbly, trying to take it all in. So I got dressed, went downstairs, and I tried to explain to my parents what I'd seen, but I was greeted by a sharp shh, because they were trying to listen to the radio. Which is understandable, really, because the radio was our connection with what was going on with the war. People from all over Stanley were phoning in, saying what they could see. This is quite possibly the first ever phone-in war that everybody could hear on the radio. And amazingly, one of the ladies who worked at the radio station had the presence of mind to record it all. Dear Miriam Booth. So it's recorded, all these people, you can hear on YouTube, all these phone calls calling in saying, well, I live at White City and there's a huge battle. White City means 3 or 4 prefabricated white houses at the top of Stanley. Okay, there they were. There was a big battle there, and that's where our amazing Royal Marines actually engaged with one of the Amtraks. You'll hear more about these later. Large armoured personnel carriers carrying 20 plus men inside, and they actually took one of them out in this huge gun battle that's going on there. The Argentines retaliated. They put some holes through people's houses. It was horrendous. Big mess up there. And so they were phoning in saying, this one lovely guy said, well, I can see the stars through my roof. Why? Because the Argies have just put a hole in my roof. I know, horrendous. And so there was water coming down onto him from his water tank. And he was like, well, just lay low until you can get out. You should be okay. So looking outside our house, we could just see the Royal Marines and the Argentines running, shooting right outside on our playing ground, on our streets. There were suddenly these Argies invading. But our brave Royal Marines doing their thing. I had no clue that that's what Royal Marines did, because we'd just seen them as the guys around and about, you know. They were friendly garrison in town, and suddenly there they were, serious, well-equipped, hardcore fighting guys. I remember saying to my parents, they're fighting like lions. It was amazing and scary. Turn over the page. I'm really not following my script at all, but it sounds quite interesting, so we're okay. Somewhere along the line, the shooting did stop, and we were informed that we weren't allowed to go out of our houses, and that unless we really needed to go out to feed the animals, we had some hens, but they could wait, and our cat was in, so we were all good. The phone rang, and Mum was informed that she needed to go to work because the hospital was very busy. So she had to inform the broadcasting station. If you listen to this recording of the broadcasting of Invasion Day, you'll hear it announced that Nurse Valerie Bennett is heading off to work and that Argentine troops should protect her and keep her because she's a nurse. So what happened was Mum put on her full uniform and Dad got this broomstick, tied a white pillowcase to it. And so we just stood in our house in the front, in the bay window at the front of the house, and we watched as she walked across the road, down the steps, across the playing field, carrying this white flag. But of course we didn't know what was going to happen to her next. Just half an hour before, there'd been battles going on this playing field, up and down these streets. And there was brave nurse Mum going off to meet the casualties from this battle. Sooner or later, these horrendous Amtraks, LVPT7, is that the right way around? LVPT7, landing vehicle, P something or other, T, troops. Exactly, personnel tracked, thank you very much. 7, but they get more than 7 people in there. I guess that's version 7. Anyway, them arrived. Huge. They looked like tanks, big tracks on them, gun on top, sometimes with a guy peeping out the top and looking around, rumbling through our little streets, ripping up the whatever the covering's called on the streets, tarmac on the streets. Because when they're going along, it's bad enough, but when they try and turn the corner, one track stops, the other one goes a bit faster, it really rips it up. Little Stanley was not designed for such visitors. And so loads of them came into Stanley. And with that, remember the day before, I'd been surprised by one aircraft being out of place and flying down the harbour. Suddenly there were loads and loads of aircrafts that we definitely didn't recognise. There were helicopters coming and going to the airport and flying up to land on the football pitch to take away some casualties from around Government House and other places. There were planes in the sky, these Hercules coming and going from the airport. There were planes going out to land, helicopters to go out to land on their aircraft carrier. They bought the 25th of May, 25 de Mayo, their aircraft carrier, that many of you have probably spied at and tried to target. Anyway, out into Port William. And so we watched her from our back garden as well. Just also totally wrong. The day before, I'd been concerned about one small red plane being in the wrong place, and suddenly we were invaded. Our skies were full. Our streets were full. Everywhere was full. We were standing out in the front garden for a while, just watching. My sister got a telescope out and had a look to see if she could see what was going on at the airport. This RGs who were patrolling the street just came up and with the barrel of the gun, tapped the end of her telescope and said, "No, you can't do that." I was like, yeah, I can actually spy whatever I like with my telescope. Anyway, she didn't. We retreated into the house and watched from there instead. One of the things on the subject of these Amtraks, one of the things we did see was on the other side of Stanley Harbour, we call it the Camber. It's kind of sloped. First of all, it's the Camber, and it goes along to Navy Point, which is a Navy yard with some big fuel tanks and some houses there and so on. And so we watched as these Amtraks went along the other side, just 2 of them. One of them shed its tank, so they had to shed its track, so they had to fly across in a helicopter, fix it up, carrying on. We watched this with our binoculars from inside the house, and then just watched, and they went all the way along the Camber to the big stone house that was there, where Hector and Millie lived. Thankfully, Hector and Millie weren't there that night. And they just fired and fired and fired at the house and at the rocks around it. There apparently no reason at all. Some rumours are that there were some Royal Marines who were taking pop shots at them, but the Royal Marines are saying, no, we were long gone by then. And they were either captured and rounded up or told to stop fighting. Or they'd headed for the hills. There were just 6 of them who did that. So there was no Royal Marines there. So the RGs were just shooting at Hector and Millie's stone house for random reasons not understood. I could quote Sir Rex Hunt at this point and say bloody RGs, but I shouldn't because that might not be quite polite. I can. Then we watched I carried on listening to the radio, of course, and heard the Argentines taking over the radio station, taking over everything around, just herring around in their vehicles, being excited and delighted that they were victorious and their 6,000 invading forces had subdued the defence force and these 60 Royal Marines and had taken over. They instructed the Royal Marines to stop shooting. They gathered most of them together on the greens, the lawns in front of Government House. And then they took them away. We watched some of them coming past. This was such a lonely, terrible moment. We saw the governor leaving, being driven away along the road in front of our house, or the next road over, St Mary's Walk. And then we watched this big, different kind of personnel carrier. Kind of looks like a boat with the wheels. What they're called, larks? Yeah, those things, L-A-R-C. I'm looking at somebody as if they know. See, if Gibbo was standing here, he'd be like, yeah, love, that's what they're called. Oh, dear Gibbo. He would be. He'd be standing right there at the bar. I don't know where he is this week. Anyway, those. And so full of Royal Marines. And we just watched them as they drove past. I think they were supposed to be sitting down, but one of the guys was standing up. And just as we drove past, my dad, who was standing by me, just said, there go our boys. And we just felt alone and not abandoned, just alone and so far away from anyone else in the world and full of argies. Okay, let's talk about some birthday parties. Doesn't get any lighter or happier, but I thought I'd say birthday parties just to make it sound as if it's more exciting. So as we know, we could raise our glasses at this moment. We'll do some toasts later, but we could raise our glasses. 21st of April, it's Her Majesty the Queen's birthday. Her Majesty the Queen. Coincidentally, the day of my friend's birthday party, well, that was the cover we had on it. One of the teachers, we had no school by then, we still had no school going on. One of the teachers invited all the kids who were left in Stanley to come to her house for a birthday party. Obviously, it was a birthday party for the Queen, but we didn't make this quite so obvious. We're having a birthday party, and their house was right at the end of Ross Road West, up by where the beaver hangers were. Amazing view all over the harbour, and we could see out into Port William as well. As we were just standing looking out the windows, doing whatever kids do at birthday parties, we saw these Argentine warplanes, so Pucaras, coming in, swooping low, bombing two of the islands out in Port William. They usually, nobody lives on them, they're just steep islands covered in tuffet grass with lots of wildlife living on them, seals, penguins, whatever. Thankfully, most of them weren't there at that time, but the Argies were coming in, bombing them. Huge flames coming up, and then this just blackest of black smoke. We were worried about the wildlife, and the sound. So if I say it's a picture in my mind, yeah, but it's the sound. Those of you who remember that noise of the Pucaras, those of you who are plane geeks will know, oh yes, that's that kind of engine that Pucaras have in them. Yeah, it's that noise of a Pucara that you recognise and you'll know that it's with you. Google it if you really want to know. It's that noise. Afterwards, we were talking about it with my dad, and of course, gossip and speculation around Stanley. We're talking about it with my dad, and he talked to Bloomer Reeve, the colonel who was kind of civilian and military liaison guy and quite senior RG, who we affectionately called Bloomer, which is really quite funny because he didn't know that Bloomer meant knickers. So everybody called him Bloomer, even in the book. Did I mention I've written a book about this? Anyway, in the book, he gets affectionately referred to as Bloomer all the way through. Anyway, Dad had talked to Bloomer about this situation, and they'd been doing military practice. And there was great speculation that it was actually napalm, which indeed it was. It was the napalm that they'd stored at the airport. So we watched napalm being used on these islands. Furthermore, it seems very likely, and this is huge. If you want to get into one of those fights on the internet, this is something you can talk about. There were some bodies, Argentine bodies, that happened on invasion day and around then, and it would seem they were transported out to these islands and were disposed of with the napalm. I'm not getting into that argument, but that's what the situation is, and And moving on to the next story, 27th of April, happy birthday to me. Yeah, oh yeah, scarf. Thankfully, we had my party, and unusually we had my birthday party the weekend before my birthday. That just worked out with my mum's shifts. One of the things I remember about it is that we did have this lovely trifle, but the lad from next door had managed to sit in it. I have no idea how or why. Anyway, he needed to go home and change. Because he was a trifle messy. I do remember walking home with the people, with Mum afterwards, the ones who weren't being picked up. We kind of did a walking convoy to various places. And Mum and I walked up as far as Government House. Outside Government House, kind of, if you're standing outside Government House and you turn left, there was this lovely crazy paving path that goes to those steps that goes up through the gorse up to Little Italy. And we always used to play this family game, don't step on the lines between the crazy paving, Merry Monster. So we're kind of looking forward to playing this, yeah.
Steady.
Oh, I never ever stepped on those lines. Bless. So I was kind of thinking, well, okay, we'll go up to those steps, play the game, and then we'll go back. But the RGs had parked a helicopter and a whole load of other stuff on those crazy pavings. I mean, how rude. We were supposed to be playing this game, but instead Argentine military had descended on our place to play. And that's kind of a picture of everything that was going on in Stanley. They parked all their stuff everywhere. They'd taken over our school as a barracks. They'd taken over any piece of land that was available, dug stuff in, put oil drums in, standing in there in the oil drums as positions, big guns all over the place, in amongst the houses. Yeah, that's not exactly polite, is it? Putting your guns amongst people's houses. There's rules about that. So there they were. No game available because the RGs had pitched up there too. Well then, if we look at Mr. Dave Price's shirt there, we can see a Vulcan bomber because we've got a Vulcan here in Carlisle Airport. I know, how good is that? And so it's a little bit further away from here now, but not much further away than Stanley Airport was from our house. Just how long? 3 miles away to Carlisle Airport? Okay, so we were about 3 miles, yeah. Sorry? So we were about 3 miles away from Stanley Airport in our house. We were actually at Carlisle Airport a few years ago when the Vulcans were doing, do you remember they came flying all over Britain, sort of doing a final flypast for everybody? And I was just getting out of my car and this high-vis, very important person who works at the airport came up to me and said, you have to be aware that it is going to get quite noisy because those Vulcans are very loud. And I said to him, oh yeah, I know, I've been bombed by them before. And he just walked off with that she's drunk look on his face. And I'm like, yeah, I've been bombed by them before. And indeed I have. What happened was, my sister and I were asleep at my granddad's house. He just lived a few doors along, and to give him some company, my sister and I just spent some evenings there. Mum and Dad were often working and so on. So it was early in the morning and we were both asleep. We were supposed to be sleeping on the floor, but I wasn't into this sleeping on the floor lark, so I was sleeping on the sofa. But yeah, very good, yeah, sleeping on the floor was coming later in the war. So it was just this hugest, most enormous noise that I'd ever heard. It wasn't just noise that comes through the air, it's noise that comes through the ground as well. This whole buzzy, just thick, heavy noise. We had no idea what on earth was going on. We couldn't imagine what it could possibly be. And then there was just planes in the air. I can't say, oh, I heard the roar of the Vulcans or I heard the Harriers that were with them or anything like that. It was just big noise. So we scarpered into our emergency room, which is the under the stairs cupboard, and we just hid there, my sister and I. And Grandad came from his room and checked what we were doing, and he was a man of great faith. So he stood there leaning on his walking stick and he prayed for us, and it was just so lovely. And then after the noise had finished and all that, RGs were big on their anti-aircraft guns. Any time a plane came nearby, they'd just shoot at the sky in the hope they would hit it. And so outside, there was huge noise of vehicles. Grandad's house was just across the road from the hospital. And so the hospital got very busy from these Vulcans visiting as well. I remember that, just a picture in my mind, Grandad had already gone back to bed because it all quietened off. And Isabel and I were just sitting with our sleeping bags up to our waists in this understairs cupboard, just leaning against each other. And we had this emergency bag, and it had Cadbury's chocolate in it. And so I think this is a good point to reach into the bowls in front of you and take a chocolate, to just think of me and Isabel, because we were there sitting, eating our Cadbury's dairy milk, and just not really sure what was going on, but we were quite sure that this was an emergency, and we were allowed to eat our emergency chocolate at that point. The Vulcan bombings were amazing. Of course, they're amazing. Getting planes, that huge operation to get them all the way to Stanley Airport, more than once to do these bombing runs, was hugely spectacular. And I would say that the morale of the RGs really plummeted because suddenly the British were close. Suddenly they weren't out of reach anymore. And these little islands 8,000 miles away, hey, we can get you and we can bother you big time. They sustained lots of casualties. The hospital where Mum worked had two parts, and the older part had lots of rooms in it. Anyway, the Argentines took over the older part of the hospital, and the old people who lived in there in residential care were kicked out, so they needed to be put in other parts of the hospital. And the RGs just annexed half of the hospital for their casualties that they got, particularly during these Vulcan bombings, but then afterwards as well. But the morale of the locals, the British locals, of course, were British, the morale of the locals just rose. It was like, yes, they're on their way, they're nearly here. If they can bomb the airport, that means they're close, right? And we were really pleased and very optimistic. We knew you were coming. We always knew that you would be coming. That's not an issue here. But the fact was that, hey, you've just put some metal in holes in the airport. This is getting really serious. This is good. This is close. Let's sneak in another birthday. 3rd of May was my mum's birthday. And that was, we were still staying at my granddad's house then. And this was the night of the first of many gunfights, RGs between RGs. Who needs enemies when you can just have gunfights amongst yourselves, hey? And so something spooked them, and they were just shooting and shooting at each other up and down the front row, managed to catch fire to the gorse bushes around the government house, and, you know, the monument for the First World War on top of the hill there, the 1914 Battle of the Falklands, featuring HMS Glasgow, right on the top of the hill there. So it's surrounded by gorse bushes, and somehow in this firefight, they managed to set fire to the gorse bushes too. Dad looked at it and thought, there's no way I'm calling my men out to put out a fire in the middle of the night with a gunfight going on, and it's only gorse bushes and it's not blowing in the direction of anything where anybody lives, so he didn't go out. And the next day, with great trepidation, he went to work thinking, oh, the RGs are going to really do me in now. But no, the officer who was, not Bloomer, but a different officer who was dealing with him, the colonel, said to him, that was the right thing to do. And actually, you know what? I'm going to give you 6 Argentines and a translator, and you have to train them to use your equipment so then they can go out at night and fight fires. Because here's the thing. The RGs invaded, but they forgot to bring any firefighting equipment. They didn't bring any fire engines, they didn't bring any fire extinguishers, they didn't bring any hoses, they didn't bring any nothing. If I was planning to invade somewhere, I think I would take a couple of Fireman Sams with me, but hey, I didn't. So Dad had this Bonugli and a few other guys to train in how to use fire engines, and they did actually put out a couple of fires overnight. caused by the RGs, or maybe slightly caused by some metal that the British sent in our direction, but that's fine. Do I really want to tell this story? Okay, it just gets darker. I have these dilemmas with myself. The stuff I experienced was when I was 10 and when I was 11 years old. So it's all right to tell everybody, right? Because I was only a kid. And then I think to myself, no, but this stuff is really horrible. Okay, let's go. It's going horribler. Okay, horribler. I've edited out the horrible list. This one is a story of shipping container guy. So shipping containers come in two sizes, 20 foot and 40 foot. This is talking about a 20-foot shipping container. And, see, I'm getting nervous. I'm swishing my hair back. Not so nervous that I've put it up, but it's swishing it back. The psychology of Rachel's hair is very interesting. Colin's behind me. For a couple of days, we'd noticed the RGs were always doing weird things that we didn't understand, which in Stanley, we were a population of 800 people normally, maybe stretching up to 1,000, not quite sure how many we were in those days. But everybody knew everybody. Many people related to each other. We always knew what was happening. We knew who drove what vehicle. We knew everybody who lived everywhere. We knew everybody's jobs. Everybody knew everybody. And suddenly the RGs turn up and they do things that we firstly don't know what they're doing. We don't know why they're doing them. And we just didn't understand the logic behind them. So across at the other side of the playing field, there was some gardens. Fire station, gardens. And in one of these gardens, the RGs had started digging this huge hole. We're like, what this time? Why are they digging a huge hole? Okay. So we stood and we watched. And then one day it became apparent what they were doing. Mum and I were actually standing just in the bay window at the front of our house watching. And the RGs turned up with a truck with a shipping container on the back of it and with a crane. And we realized what they were going to do is put this shipping container into the hole. It was either going to be full of food, for food supplies, or it was some kind of emergency bunker. There had been quite a lot of RGs in trucks parking along the road to the side of the playing field overnight, sort of living in their trucks, sleeping in them. And we wondered if this was accommodation in a shipping container for them. Anyway, we didn't know, but we realized they were going to put this box in the hole. We stood and watched as the guy climbed up on top of the container, the crane lowered, and he connected the hooks to each of the four corners. And then first mistake, he stayed standing. Anybody who's read the book will know this story. He stayed standing on top of the shipping container. And there he was holding on with his two hands to these wires, these cables that were attached to the two corners. And watching, just looking so proud of himself, his mate on the ground. He was shouting out what the view was, whatever he was doing there. He was just looking proud of himself. Next problem, Stanley Power comes through overhead power cables. And there was some live, you got the story already, it's not funny and it's horrible. And so these live power cables, they hadn't done the health and safety assessment, they hadn't switched them off, they hadn't disconnected them or anything. The idea was that they lift the crane, they crane the container off the back of the truck, over the wires, and lower it into this hole in the ground. Except they didn't get quite high enough. The container swung, hit the live power cables, massive flashes, and the poor guy, he just collapsed, and they lowered the crane amongst much, much shouting and RG, hand waving and all that stuff. Lowered it to the ground, nipped along to the fire station, got a ladder up onto the top of the container and took the poor guy's body down. Yeah, not a nice picture to have in my mind. Life in Stanley as Brits under RG occupation was lonely, and it was frightening. I've never felt more isolated. The BBC News, bless the BBC, was pretty much our only contact with the outside world, and that was often blocked. The RGs had these transmitters where they blocked anything, so we'd be kind of twisting around trying to find out where we could hear it. Was BBC Africa going to talk to us today? There was some Radio Moscow or something in English. We used to listen to that sometimes, but they often didn't mention anything at all. But just became experts at twisting around the radio frequencies, trying to find out what was going on. Then there were, of course, bless the Harriers, bless the Sea Harriers, the daily visits of these little triangular friends, sometimes way up in the sky and sometimes really low down doing their business. So I remember one day watching one flying down the hill next to our house, and we could see the pilot sitting in his seat. I'm sure we could. And then he just went off and did what he needed to do, what mischief needed to take place. And we were so encouraged by these Harriers coming. So all of you who are involved in aircraft carriers, all of you who are involved in the Harriers, the Royal Engineers, of course, setting up the airbase there. Port San Carlos, Ajax Bay. Yeah, just amazing. So encouraging to see these guys. Unfortunately, we did see one being shot down, Ian Morts. I think it was the 1st of June. Mid-afternoon we watched, and then the RGs who shot at everything that moved sadly shot down his plane, and we watched him, still being shot at, coming down on his parachute. He survived. We heard the next day on the BBC that or the day after that he'd been rescued overnight. But we were desperate to find out what happened to him, and the RGs took off and they flew out in a helicopter, obviously, to try and find him. And when this helicopter came back to the football pitch, I'm sure that half the population of Stanley went herring along to watch this. The Argentine TV camera was there. We were all waiting and watching to see this British guy be rescued. And just an RG got off the helicopter. We're like, oh, is that it? Where did you come from? I think they'd rescued one of their own pilots who'd been shot down. Was it that Hercules got shot down on the same day? Not sure. Anyway, so, but I would really quite like to meet Ian Mortimer one day, Morts, and just say, hi. Hey, I could send him a scarf. Okay, let's talk about Dried Onion Day. Here my lack of military knowledge will become even more apparent. And Dried Onion Day. So you know what dried onions are? These dehydrated onions that you can soak in boiling water to make them look a bit more like onions. So I was at the back of our house in the pantry making topping to go on pizza. We still had flour and we still had yeast, so we had the dough rising in the airing cupboard. And I was making pizza topping. Dad and Mum was at work in the hospital, and Dad and Isabel, they were at the front of the house in this famous bay window where we watched the whole war happening pretty much. And they were just sitting there doing whatever you do when your daughter's making supper. And it was before blackouts were put down, because from the 27th of April we had to put up blackouts every night, and we had overnight curfew from 6 o'clock. And then closer to the Liberation Day, we had to have curfew from 4:30 in the afternoon to 8:30 the following morning. It's a very, very long, nasty time. So Dad and Isabel were sitting in the front of the house just kind of looking out, wondering what on earth the RGs were up to this time. And I'm in the back, and I remember exactly what cup it was. You know how you get Easter eggs in cups? Well, I had one of those cups, and it was a koala bear cup. And I'd soaked the onions in this cup, and they were just there on the work surface, just doing their thing. Suddenly, there was this mother-in-law of all enormous bangs. Perhaps it was two anyway. It's enormous bang, huge, loud. It wasn't just noise. I think it was bigger than the Vulcan noise. It was one of those through the feet, through the air. It felt like everything was in slow motion. It felt like the air had gone to like jelly, or, you know, heat haze that you see when you're driving on the motorway, over that kind of wiggly air. It was just the most weird thing, and everything went slow. And I looked at my cup. Remember these precious dehydrated onions that was a bad time to have a bang, eh? These dehydrated onions that were just sitting there waiting to be precious ingredient in our pizza topping. They leapt out of the cup. The cup stayed on the work surface, but these onions leapt out of the cup. Didn't somersault, but it would be funny if they did. Through the air and splot onto the ground. but the cup stayed exactly where it was. Meanwhile, Dad and Isabel, sitting in the front of the house, could see the noise coming across the harbour towards them like this wave of wiggly, and then it hit, and then they could hear the noise. In the hospital, my mum was in the maternity ward. Taff and Mrs. I've forgotten her name, Davis, had recently had a baby. It was that famous baby where they held the British flag over the mother, so when my mum, the midwife, delivered the baby, she was born under a British flag. How cool is that? So it was that baby. And so Mum was standing in the maternity ward on a stool, pushing up one of those sash windows. It wasn't quite closed when the noise hit, and it blew her backwards onto the new mum's bed. She wasn't injured. The window didn't break, but the noise. How does this work? I have no idea about the science of explosions. People all over Stanley had similar experiences of being blown to the ground. Of some things did break, and we don't quite know what had gone on, but other side of the harbour is the Canberra, and the explosion happened down the back of the Canberra, so Murrell River, end of Port William area. It seemed that the RGs probably had some ammunition, weapons, whatever, stored there, and the Harriers found it and just dropped a few calling cards and exploded my onions. So we call that Dried Onion Day. Let's talk about some textiles. I didn't bring it, but I could have done. I had this faithful pillowcase. My kids have used it. It's just the pillowcase that I've always had, and it's in our airing cupboard today. That's the second mention of an airing cupboard. I don't think I've mentioned airing cupboards from one year to the next, but suddenly in one day, 2 mentions of airing cupboards. Anyway, we've got this. I've got this pillowcase with animals on it, and it was my favourite pillowcase, and they're my friendly animals. So during the bombardments, overnight, shells coming. Thanks, guys. We love the sound of freedom, shells coming. But the sound just mixes up. We would hear them exploding, then we'd hear them coming overhead. Is that the right order? Then we'd hear them being fired from the ship. And we'd often wonder, because Mum in particular would have us focus on real people with real families and real stories. And we knew there were guys out there on those ships, you guys, firing those shells overnight. And we'd hear click, the pop of the shells being fired. And we think, yeah, there are real people out there with real families at home in England. But it was noisy. Yeah, you guys who are in the hills, you know it was noisy too, hey? And so I tried to put the pillow over my head and on my ears, but it didn't block out the sound. That was my number one textile. Number two textile is some curtains. There aren't any curtains in here, but our living room curtains, heavy fabric, and it was lined. So during the day, we'd take down the blackout so we could see out and spy on the RGs through this famous window. And I was always very fascinated in what the RGs were up to. Particular interest to me later on in the war was what was going on a plot of land that was literally as close to our house as the back wall of this room, okay? Where you guys are sitting, that could be as close as the RGs were to me. And that was a plot of land that Dad had just taken over renting that we were going to use to grow potatoes in. But the RGs decided that they were going to plant a big gun in there instead. And so they dug themselves in all around it, and there was an old hen house there. And they had this officer who proudly stood guard on all he could see, this old hen house and a potato garden. But what's interesting to me was on his 9mm pistol, I later found out there was one of those, it had this quite intricate pattern of kind of salmon-coloured mother of pearl. And that just fascinated me, and I liked looking and wondering what he was up to. But I decided to deploy a tactic that I'd initially used in hide-and-seek for this military observation. So hide-and-seek, a great place to hide is inside the curtains, between the lining and the curtain itself. I went in there one day with my scissors and I cut spy holes. I could sell this secret to the SAS, I tell you. So I cut spy holes in the curtain linings, and I would just stand there for ages and ages and ages watching these RGs and not being seen and thinking I was nice and safe and just watching what was going on. Liberation Day. Think about where you were on Liberation Day, and after I finish talking, which will be quite soon actually, we can just share some of your stories as well. We'll turn the recording off because I appreciate that most of you probably don't want to be recorded. And if you do, we can record your stories separately. That's great too. My Liberation Day was noisy. Yeah, you're noisy. Yeah, everybody's noisy. We'd had these 3-day bombardment. The ships shelling the hills shelling the ships, the RGs in Stanley all around us, including guns in amongst our houses, shelling everybody that seemed to be needing shelling. They did get a bit quicker though, the RGs. We timed them, and over the days they kind of decreased their reload time by a couple of minutes. Well done them, I guess. The Royal Engineers have do not do that photo, guys. The Royal Engineers have a very affectionate place for this gun that fired. Yeah, 105mm up by the Met station. And there was a second one by Sapper Hill as well. And they were just pointed, the Sapper Hill one was pointed at Mount Longdon. Yeah. So it was very, very noisy day and night. It was just horrendous times. There was a Red Cross ship in Stanley Harbour, and it by day was dealing with casualties, and by day it was offloading food supplies to the RGs. They gave us boxes of beef, and by night they were doing other more military activities, but by day they were doing Red Cross stuff. And so we had this box of beef, and just the only people really left on our street anyway, our closest neighbours were a lovely guy called Ramon. He's Chilean, and his wife and family. We knew them really well. We went along and we spent the day on the 13th of June cooking empanadas, which is small little tasty, spicy pastries with beef and olives and boiled eggs and some raisins. Just taste the most delicious things. And so we were there eating them. I know you guys were really busy, but we were just kind of sitting around waiting for the waterway, and so we were eating our Red Cross beef at our friends' houses, which makes me feel a bit guilty because I should have been hiding under the table or something. But their house had a stone. The back of the house was made of stone, so there was safer than our house. But the day of the liberation itself, let's do this. Let me wind back a little bit. We didn't go out much. I could read this actually, couldn't I? So I can catch up with my notes. On one of those trips out of the house, Dad, Isabel and I went to visit Grandad to check on him. He only lives a few doors down the road, and he was 70 years old, lived on his own, and his front room window looked west, so I could see what Les and you guys on Mount Longdon and other people in the hills were up to, and what was happening in the battles. We looked with binoculars and watched what was happening up on Tumbledown. Yeah, and perhaps Two Sisters. So we could see shells landing, we could see big guns firing, we could see men running. That was that close, okay, watching a battle with the binoculars. And then obviously when you're looking into binoculars, you can't see big picture because you're looking in your binoculars. From nowhere, this Harrier appeared. A split second we watched it, and this truck that I'd been tracking exploded. Just there in front of my eyes, big white flash. We speculated that it was probably carrying ammunition to go up to the hills to fire at you guys. Just a horrible, horrible picture in my mind of seeing this truck erupting and this Harrier appearing from nowhere. Didn't talk much to each other. It was just kind of somber, subdued, dull, shocked last few days. Don't remember eating or drinking much, just sitting, waiting, listening to the radio, hearing news on the radio of battles, ships sunk, helicopters shot down. Just numb, terrible, horrible, helpless. Even my bombardment pillowcase wasn't helping me in any way at all. So on the last day of the war, 14th of June, we were all listening to Dr. Alison Bellini. She conducted medical surgeries with people outside Stanley via the long-wave radio. And so people would call in and say, oh, I've got this ailment. Oh, you need to have this. And so we were just listening to that and hearing people from other parts of the Falklands, all our friends, all our relatives, hearing what was going on. That day, brave, lovely, amazing Alison, who I'm still in contact with sometimes, she said that very clearly in her beautiful Scottish accent, I would like to speak to Andrew Windsor, please. Yeah. And then Bob Ferguson, somebody mentioned Bob Ferguson just now. Bob Ferguson, way out on Weddell Island, replied he couldn't help personally, but he knew a man who could. And there was a British officer there, and they began to talk about the peace, and Alison was very instrumental in organising the peace that was coming later that day. We knew it was time to leave our house then and to go to our safe place, which was the hospital. Packed up, had to make this big decision. What do you do? We could have a show of hands. What do you do with your cat on the last day of the war? It wasn't only our cat. By then we got neighbours' cats and kittens and all sorts of things. No, not shoot them. Do you leave the cat in with food? I don't know what that means, but it's probably rude. Over my head. So what do you do? Do you put the cats out? Do you leave them in with lots of food in a little tray? I don't know. So we had this big decision, and we think we put the cats out. And then out through the front gate, watching Argies all over Stanley, just emptying the weapons onto the street, and just the conscripts were just running, heading towards the airport direction. Towards the airport, because I guess they thought that's how you get away, but away from the British, because they were coming in across the hills over at the west of Stanley. And so just all these guys not necessarily wearing outside clothes, not necessarily wearing the tin helmets, not just emptying the weapons, throwing the guns away, and off they went. And so the streets were just covered like shells on the beach, but shells from guns on the road. But there was still this bombardment going on, another well-timed bang. And there was still this bombardment going on. As we were going along the street, there were explosions, there were bullets and bits of shrapnel falling around us into the puddles, rattling on the roofs. We got to Grandad's house, which really is only a very short walk, but it seemed like a long walk, carrying our sleeping bags and our emergency bags and anything we could carry, really. Got to his house, and my sister and my dad had gone first, but Mum and I were walking down the back garden path, and then peat shed, the shed in which you store peat to burn on your stove. And standing in the doorway, there were two guys that we didn't recognise. They were military, and we just knew that they were British. Long radio, one taller than the other. One had quite lovely, I remember him just having a calm, smiley face and just sparkly eyes. And so I said, that was you. And I said, Grandad, who are those guys in your peat shed? And he said, yeah, they're just some British blokes. They come in every night, and if they get cold, and they have a smoke and a cup of tea to warm up. So I mentioned this, and he said that one of them had the name Elvis. Oh, okay, I just stuck in my mind. And so and so when I was blogging these stories last year at the beginning of lockdown on the parallel days, I blogged all my war stories in Mum and Dad's diaries. And I mentioned this, and one of the guys messaged me and said, I know who he was. And so we talked, and I can't really tell you the details, but he was the Special Forces guy, and the two of them they knew who they were. And actually, sadly, this Elvis guy has died, but I sent a scarf and it's been put on his gravestone. So to Elvis and his mate, and to my granddad. I know, what a guy, hey? Plan to be that kind of a sneaky granddad, won't you? Yeah. Or granny. So we collected granddad, went over to the hospital and just sat and waited, watched the liberation unfold. We were told that this white helicopter would indeed come and land on the football pitch, and it would bring the liberation party. And so when we knew that it was coming, we all stood at the edge of the hospital. We were told, do not make a fuss, do not cheer, do not do anything to anger the Argies. Helicopter landed, all the snow blew up. My friend Debbie, she took lots of really good photos, actually. One of them, did I mention the book? It's in the book. And so watched as the Liberation Party, I call them, the generals and the translators, walked right past us. And if you look at that photo, there's fire hoses there, because while Isabel and me and Mum and Grandad were all safely in the hospital, so Dad and his fire guys were called out in the middle of these battles, in the middle of bombardments, to put out fires that the RGs had started in buildings all over Stanley. And also some fires from where some shells had hit. But the thing is, they hadn't just set some fires because it was an accident. No, these were deliberately set fires. And if they weren't just fires that they'd set timers, a candle in the middle of these cooking blocks to let the fire start. And the houses were full of ammunition as well. Civilian houses that had been vacated by people going out of Stanley, taken over by the RGs, filled with ammunition. There's rules against that too. So Dad and his guys were out doing this, putting out fires. Somehow we were all in the right place at the right time, and the British soldiers came to the hospital. I was really tired. I just fell asleep. I was 11, okay. And so they came in, and then the next morning it was absolutely amazing, beautiful, really moving, that everything had suddenly changed. The RGs were just being rounded up and taken away. And the hospital was full of happy, tired, hungry, smelly, muddy, amazing British soldiers who were just there, and they just sat with us, and it was just so lovely to be with them and to hear their stories and to hear and just to soak up the fact that, hey, we're free. It's all different. We don't have to have, there were no guns anymore. It had gone quiet. You know, that famous phrase you hear on Remembrance Day, the moment the guns fell silent. Hey, that is an awesome, amazing moment. If you're on the ship that's been shelling, when the guns fall silent, that's a great moment, isn't it? When you're in the hills fighting a battle and the guns fall silent, that's an amazing moment, isn't it? When you're all out doing all your things that are part of this awesome task force that brought freedom to the Falklands and the guns fall silent, it's just awesome, isn't it? And so that moment of peace, of quiet, just awesome. I'm so glad. And we just sat there. Then suddenly we had to clean up Stanley. The next day, what was I doing? Picking all the masking tape, square triangles, crosses off the windows in the hospital. That was my first task on Liberation Day. It's like, yeah, we can do that now because we're not going to have shattered windows anymore. So we started with this quote, "War isn't over when it ends. Some pictures never leave your mind." And the next line in the song is where the quote really doesn't apply to me, because the next line in the song is, "They are the faces of the children we left behind." But I wasn't left behind. I was rescued by you guys, and I'm just so glad, forever grateful for my peace and freedom. Thank you. Thank you, guys.